Thank you very much, Brooke and others, for the opportunity to be here. Is this about the right volume, you think, for the video and so on? Can everyone hear me okay? Not too loud? Okay, let me know how that goes. Yeah, thank you very much for the chance to be here. It's a real pleasure. In thinking about what I might talk to you about today, knowing that it would be a fairly diverse audience, I decided that rather than try and talk about any individual projects that I've worked on, or show you any burning new data, that what I would do instead is talk about a kind of a general question, general topic that I thought might be of broad interest to folks with a variety of backgrounds. A question that has preoccupied lots of different folks, including me, kind of directly or indirectly over the years, and that is the question of origins and evolution of language, and in particular the extent to which systems of animal communication, and even more particularly systems of communication, vocal communication, I'm thinking now in particular, with respect to non-human primates, our closest animal relatives, the extent to which those might give us some traction on the problem of language origins and the evolution of language. So that's what I'm going to do, and I won't probably talk too much about specific results or findings, except insofar as they might bear on some kind of general point that I want to make. And then I wanted, hopefully, if you have the patience for it, I wanted to also talk towards the end of this a little bit about another sort of general topic, which has to do with how the theoretical constructs, theoretical frameworks that we use channel our research in important ways. That's obviously so obvious as to sound fatuous, and I'll try and clarify why I think it's not at the end, because I think there are some reasons to not accept too uncritically the fact that the theoretical frameworks that you adopt in your work and that people have adopted in this work have significantly channeled the kinds of questions they asked and how they interpret their findings, sometimes in ways I think that need really to be questioned. So that's what I hope to do. I'll say very quickly that the talk title hasn't changed, but the location has changed. I've just moved recently. I was telling Greg and then Joe and Susan earlier, who I chatted with, that I've moved from Alberta out to the East Coast, the Maritimes. So I'm now a Maritimer from New Brunswick, and I actually spent some time out there as a kid, so it's a wee bit of a coming home. And I won't, I'm embarrassed to tell you why I've moved, so I'll save that for private conversation with people later. Okay, so that's what I kind of want to do today. Brooke told me that you're in the custom of potentially taking questions throughout the talk, and we're going to break with that custom today. And that's because my talks tend to run as fixed action patterns. Okay, so it's going to start and then it's going to go right to the end without interruption. And that's for your benefit, really, because if you ask a question, then we're going to start back at the beginning of that fixed action pattern and roll right to the end. Having said that, I'm very, very happy to talk about anything in here afterwards, immediately afterwards, or whatever other opportunities we have, because I will be talking at a kind of a general or high level and making some claims that I would expect people would like to dispute. Okay, so I just won't give you that opportunity in the middle of the talk. I've actually only ever taken questions in the middle of a talk once before, and that was for one of two jobs that I interviewed for. And I didn't get the one that I took a question in, so I have a reason for not taking questions too. Before we get started, just let me do the most important thing, which is to acknowledge a few of the many people who have contributed to. Also a little peripatetic when I talk, I move around. I'll be careful not to get right under the speaker and create a little issue of feedback here. A few of the many people who have been involved over the years in projects that bear on the topics we want to talk about today, namely lots of undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Lethbridge, where I've been for a number of years. A few of the recent ones shown here, and then a couple of really key long-term collaborators, first being my good friend and long-term colleague and collaborator, Michael Ovren, and then in the bottom right-hand corner, my wife, who has been a key, absolutely essential partner throughout my career, if a kind of a silent one, at least officially and scientifically. So yeah, without their help, obviously, I wouldn't have been able to say any of the heretical things that I have, so they're partly to blame as well. Okay, so I need hardly emphasize for you all that the question of language origins, a fundamental problem in human evolution, with implications for all kinds of things about the human condition, origins of complex thought, culture, technology, etc. I also need hardly emphasize the fact that it's an especially difficult, challenging problem because language behavior doesn't leave a lot of clear clues to its history and prehistory. And so a natural solution, one possible solution to this is to adopt a comparative stance, study communication systems of other animals and look for the rudiments of key elements of language in their communication systems, and naturally enough to look perhaps first at closely related primate species. The conceptual agenda, I would say, for this comparatively based research program on animal communication systems and primate communication systems in particular, I'd say, was established in the 1970s. And I think if you had to trace it to a particular person, you'd trace it to this fellow here, Don Griffin, who many of you will know as having been instrumentally involved in the discovery of bat echolocation, that is, how bats navigate their way through the dark, using a series of high-frequency ultrasonic click sounds that they listen for the reflected echoes and use those sounds to navigate. Don was absolutely essential with a team of other people in discovering this, but I would say in many ways one of his most enduring contributions to what we want to talk about today has to do with the extent to which he then saw this as a way of reopening questions of animal thinking, animal consciousness, wrote a few popular books. This one, first of them, I think, in 1974, The Question of Animal Awareness. This was formerly a taboo subject for many years, mid-20th century, where the strictures of behaviorism in psychology sort of forbid us from talking about animal mental life, even human mental life, and Don really saw the really breakthrough finding of understanding how a bat's dark world is in fact illuminated for it by these echolocation clicks. He developed this sort of metaphor that communication can then serve as a really privileged source of insight into how minds work. And he sort of then developed this metaphor as communication as a window on the mind. And that metaphor wasn't lost on one of his Rockefeller colleagues late in his career. The fellow on the right over here is Peter Marler, of course, who was an enthusiastic uptaker of that metaphor, along with then a generation of scholars that trained under him. I'm pointing here to Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney, who are folks that you'll know from their groundbreaking research on communication systems of vervet monkeys that was summarized in this, what I would say is one of the at least in my opinion, one of the best kind of popular science books that's ever been written, How Monkeys See the World, based on the metaphor that understanding their system of communication can give us some insight into how their minds work. And if you had to trace this agenda to a single pithy quote, I'd say it comes right here in this book from Don Griffin. Insofar as linguists and philosophers have been correct in linking human thinking so closely to language, the communication behavior of other species is bound to suggest conscious thought to roughly the extent it shares essential features with human speech. And from that point forward, then, this group of folks then was absolutely instrumental then in using language as a key metaphor for research in animal communication. And this research agenda, I'll call sort of the Languagerudiments Agenda, seemed very sensible. It is rationally based, but I would argue that it's led us to look in the wrong places, a little bit like the drunk guy who fumbles around in the dark, looking for his keys here under the light of the lamp, rather than next to his car where he probably dropped them. And when you ask him, why are you looking there? He says, well, that's just simply where the light is best. Keys aren't likely to be there, but I can see here. I can't see over by the car. And so what I would argue is that a lot of the research agenda spurred by Don Griffin and Peter Marler's uptake of that has been looking in a particular place, and that is at high-level informational properties of language based on a kind of conventional characterization of language in information systems terms as this: an intentional, deliberative process of information exchange involving high-level, meaning cortical representational processes externalized via symbolic words, syntactically organized into extended meaning-bearing utterances. Okay? That's been the focus. We can extract from that what I'll call the big three of human language. One could argue what the key elements of language are. Whatever sort of shopping list you came up with, these three would certainly feature prominently in that list: intentionality, semantics, and syntax. You all have a sense of what these things entail, but just for clarification, intentionality in its formal sense really refers to the underlying cognitive impetus to inform others, and it's that underlying cognitive impetus to inform that is the implicit basis for all language acts. Okay, so it involves an implicit kind of mentalistic attribution to your audience, to the others that you're speaking to, that they think something about the world, they believe something about the world, and you, with your speech acts, attempt to influence those mental states using words then that do inform them about some state of affairs. Okay, so in this classic little sort of Gracian conversation down here between Mary and Jane, the thought bubbles refer to the implicit kind of mental attributions that are being made here. Mary thinks of Jane: well, she doesn't know what I know, but she will if I tell her X. Okay, and Jane, for her part, might have some implicit mentalistic attributions of her own. Okay, this is often referred to, at least crudely, as theory of mind, and many of you will be familiar with what that refers to from a psychological and developmental standpoint. The second, of course, is semantics, which is simply, or can be parsed simply as the conceptual content of that kind of informing, based on the shared representational value that words have for both the speaker and the listener alike. Okay, so the word bear stands for this, big furry object. It's a standing for sort of relationship, such that when Mary says, "Did you see the bear?" The idea is that that conjures in Jane's mind something related to a sort of a mental image of a bear of some kind. Okay. And then syntax, of course, is the system to organize more complex semantics. And there's just one kind of silly example of something that's a little bit more complex semantically that you have no trouble parsing at all. Okay, so very quickly then, I think the bulk of research over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly in the last 20 years, that's been focused on some of these key things, particularly intentionality in non-humans. The bulk of that research suggests that non-human primates, with some possible exceptions, are fundamentally different from human primates with respect to intentionality. They don't appreciate others as mental states. They lack a theory of other minds. Okay? They are obviously very good at reading and responding to others' behavior, but they fundamentally fail to appreciate what lies behind that. In other words, the mentalistic basis of behavior, the thoughts, beliefs, desires, and knowledge that motivate others' behavior. And we have evidence of this from a variety of domains: fieldwork, laboratory studies, the results in the field and in the lab on behavioral testing are buttressed by a variety of neuroscientific findings as well, suggesting that truly primates, again with possibly a few exceptions, lack the kind of meta-representational abilities that underlie language. Their communication is fundamentally egocentric. It's not allocentric. It's not focused on the informational needs of others. It's focused on the needs of the individual who is communicating, because they simply don't know what others know, or even that others can know about the world, and therefore they are not communicating to inform them about the world. And that's one of the, I think, really fascinating paradoxes of their communications, is that they actually fail to appreciate the functional informing value that their own signals have, which is interesting. And we have a good sense of how that reflects in general, limited frontal lobe volitional control over behavior and more importantly, over communication, which is fundamentally subcortically and limbically driven in non-human primates and fundamentally cortically and voluntarily controlled in human ones. Those neurocognitive limitations have implications then also for semantics. The fact that communication is limbically mediated and not cortically mediated in non-human primates means that language like ideation is difficult to sustain. It also means then that explicit conceptual abstractions, in other words, them having anything like sort of declarative access to any thoughts that they might have, is very doubtful. They will no doubt have implicit conceptual abstractions, but not explicit ones of the sort that are required in order to make meaningful statements about the world. And furthermore, there's very little evidence of even the simplest kinds of syntax, simple signal sequencing patterns. Here are just a couple of spectrograms from baboons. This is an extended series of grunts produced by an adult male baboon here named Arthur, approaching a small infant, typical sort of a context for a male to produce these grunts. And it's just simply the repetition of the same call over and over and over again, with no evidence of any sophisticated temporal pattern that might alter the message that's being communicated, whatever that message is. Oops. Whoop. Sorry, that was a bit of a potpourri of sounds there. Let's see if I can play just the grunts to begin with. Okay, just the same grunt vocalization produced over and over again. Here is a little different sort of a situation where you've got the concatenation of a wide range of rapidly varying kinds of sounds, from a little juvenile here who's having a kind of a weaning tantrum. Mother rejected him from the nipple. He's obviously far too old to still be nursing, and mother wisely then rejects him and suggests that he go about his business. And his response to that, as some of you who have studied critters like this or who have had children of your own will recognize right away. Right, and so there's quite a lot of variation there. One could look for a kind of a syntax, and I challenge someone to do that. I recommend that you do it only if you have tenure, okay? Because that's when you can afford to waste your time on frivolous activities, right? It won't matter. There's obviously lots of things happening here. What's functional about all this variety, I'm arguing, is that there is specifically a lack of a pattern. It is chaotic, and it's chaotic because I think it's designed to frustrate a mother's ability to resist the attempts that are the infant's attempts to assault her senses and make her kind of change her mind about submitting to nursing. And then what you kind of couldn't maybe hear very clearly at the end was that this involved the little juvenile here throwing himself on the ground and writhing around on the ground in the leaves. You could kind of hear a little at the end as a way of classic sort of regressive behavior, trying to encourage his mother to think that you're very mistaken if you think I'm this old. In fact, I'm just a very young infant is hopelessly, helpless. Save me, save me, save me. Okay, so part of a direct assault on her psychology. In contrast, there are other kinds of organisms that we know have a different kind of communication system. Here's just an example from birdsong, a species of birds that we now have been studying for the last few years, where in contrast to many species of non-human primates and other mammals besides, they have quite large signal repertoires. Their signals are put together in flexible ways. There's good evidence for hierarchical organization of signal elements. Here's the large signal repertoire from this little house wren. They have distinctive notes that are put together into syllables. syllables that go together in particular motifs called phrases that are used to build songs. That's not my terminology. That's just existing terminology in the birdsong literature. Okay, so songs are a concatenation of different notes that can be grouped into syllables and then into little phrases of common syllables concatenated together, concatenated then with other forms of syllables into these longer song types, and then by the addition, deletion, substitution of different syllables, they can create very large repertoires of song types. Our house wrens here, we have producing in excess of 600 different such song types like this over the course of a single season. And that kind of modification of song structure to create novel song types obeys clear sequencing rules, clear sequencing patterns. Okay? And this has been well demonstrated by lots and lots of other people long before us looking at these house wrens. And I know you're aware of that. But this is just an example of that to contrast with the lack of such effects in primate communication. Okay? So returning then to the big three of human language, intentionality, semantics, and syntax, I would say that all three of these are fundamentally lacking. We could talk some more about this afterwards if people are a little more reluctant to accept that conclusion. It's a bald one, I know. But I think it actually makes pretty good functional sense in a way. You can think of these things actually as representing a bit of a functional hierarchy with intentionality at the bottom. That is truly the sort of the foundation of certainly linguistic communication. Again, that cognitive impetus to informing, lacking that cognitive impetus to inform, then there is no need for a conceptual content for informing, and there's no obviously syntactical system required to organize any more complex semantics. So lacking this, then it's not too surprising then that they would potentially lack the other two. Okay, so is primate communication entirely irrelevant to understanding language origins? In the title of the talk, I deliberately put the IR in brackets so that you parse the title as primate communication as being relevant or irrelevant to language origins. The irrelevant part, I think, is this part here, but that is not to say that I think it is entirely irrelevant. I think we just need to shift the focus of investigation, okay? Obviously, non-human primates as our closest living ancestors, there will be continuity in various elements of their communication systems that should give us some traction on the problem of language origins and language evolution. I just think that the continuity doesn't lie there, but in some other places. And so what I wanted to do now was talk a little bit about where I think there's some reason to be focused and more optimistic about what we might find. To do that, I'd recommend going back to basics, to general vocal anatomy and the mechanics of vocal production in human and non-human primates, which are parsed in a very sort of broad way, quite similar. There are obviously some key important differences between the underlying vocal anatomy and mechanics of vocal production in human and non-human primates, and those play a really essential role in some of what's unique about the vocal production patterns and acoustics of human language, but overall the general system is the same and in the following ways. Okay, there is a sound source in the larynx, or your so-called voice box, which involves the vibration of vocal folds in the larynx to create, at least for certain kinds of sounds, a stable pattern of vocal fold vibration that we interpret perceptually as the pitch of vocalization, and it's often denoted as F0, which just refers to as the fundamental frequency of vocalization. Perceptually, that's what you hear as the pitch of someone's voice. And if you were to take a microphone and measure it at the laryngeal source, drop a microphone down in the vocal tract and measure it right here, it would have a frequency spectrum that looks like this. Frequency on this axis, amplitude on this axis, and a exponentially decaying sort of power function where each of these little nicely spaced energy bands refers to harmonics of that fundamental frequency. Okay? So it produces a spectrally kind of rich sound. That sound passes up through the cavities above the larynx, and those supralaryngeal vocal tract cavities then act as a filter on this sound that is passing through and emphasize certain frequencies and attenuate other frequencies. So the transfer function of the vocal tract looks like this in stylized form for the basic vowel sound of human speech, with a few peaks in the transfer function where frequencies pass readily, and then lots of troughs where those frequencies are attenuated. And then the pattern that is actually exits the mouth then is a complex function of this superimposed on this, which gives you this more complex kind of frequency spectrum, where the peaks in the frequency spectrum here, now denoted F1, 2, 3, and 4, refer to the resonances of the vocal tract and contribute to its timbral quality. They're also denoted here as F1, 2, 3, and 4 because in linguistic terms those are referred to as the formants of canonical sorts of vowel sounds, and they're the kinds of things that you pay particular attention to in discriminating different phonemes of language. Okay, so the mechanics of vocal production then are the same in human and non-human primates: laryngeal source, supralaryngeal vocal tract cavities, exactly the same kind of dynamics, yielding some similar vowel-type sounds in the two groups. So here is a canonical vowel sound, just the neutral vowel pronounced by a male and a female speaker, showing you nice, rich frequency spectrum in the male, similarly rich spectrum in the female, but wider spacing of the harmonics. That's because females have a higher pitched voice, so this F0 is a little higher, and then all the spacing between the interval harmonics is greater than as a result, so a little bit more sparsely sampled frequency spectrum. But then the vocal tract resonances superimposed on that, these are these more dark bands, smudges, okay, here, 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 F1, 2, 3, and 4, which are also a little higher in females than they are in males because females have shorter vocal tracts and therefore have naturally higher frequency resonances. You see exactly the same pattern non-human primates epitomized by the baboon here. This is a grunt produced by a male and female, exactly the same pattern. Higher fundamental frequency in females compared to males, higher resonances in female compared to male, so exactly the same sex differences between the two. The functional significance of this is that these pitch and resonance features of the voice, which are just fundamental elements of vowel-type sounds in both human and non-human primates, they cue a variety of important social distinctions, what we'll call indexical distinctions. They're indexical distinctions because they serve to point you out as a member of a particular age category, member of a particular sex, you know, whether you're large versus small. Okay, so both in human and non-human primates, older individuals, males by compared to females, and larger individuals compared to smaller individuals will have lower pitched voices because they're larger. They have a larger larynx. Sorry, I've just detected that. Larger equals larger larynx. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The difference then between older and younger, male and female, big and small, is larger versus smaller larynx, longer versus shorter vocal tract. So therefore, lower versus higher pitch, lower versus higher timbered vocalizations. And then furthermore, characteristic individual differences in voice can arise through just idiosyncratic variation in laryngeal tissues and vocal tract structures and operations. This is illustrated here in a little spectrogram panel showing vocalizations of a couple of different species. First rhesus monkeys here, and then 3 from baboons. Adult rhesus, 2 different adult female baboons, and an infant baboon. The point of showing you is just to show you the kind of the similarities in the structure of these calls, but also the differences between individuals that capture either age differences or sex differences in their voice. These are classic contact calls that are given when the animals are in this kind of dispersed pattern, moving around the environment, foraging, and they get separated from one another. In the case of baboons, they make these kind of grunt vocalizations. In the case of rhesus monkeys, they have what we call coo calls. Hoo, hoo, hoo. I'll play you a couple because that would be much better than me trying to imitate them. I'll play you a little sound clip here that actually involves 2 repetitions of the same call from each of these individuals, just to clarify. So you'll hear a repetition of this call from an adult female rhesus, then a repetition of this from one female, another female, and the infant. And you yourself, even if you've never had an opportunity to hear these guys before, will be able to hear the distinctions quite easily. Right, so even though You may have no familiarity with baboons. You're certainly perfectly capable of hearing the difference between the infant and the adult. The infant is smaller and it sounds smaller, versus right? Okay, why is this important? Because these kinds of distinctions are fundamental in coordinating social activity in primate groups. When animals get dispersed and they're foraging, they give these vocalizations, they're able to stay in touch with one another even though they can't see them, because they're able to detect these age, sex, size, and individual differences in voice, and then choose who they want to stay with, close to, who they want to remain some distance from. Okay? This is critical to the social complexity for which primates are noted. Okay? So a great deal of the complexity of primate sociality stems from the complexity of the network of kinds of social interactions and social distinctions that they recognize within their groups. Okay? So who's who is everything. So within a primate group, it matters quite a lot, whether you're a male versus a female, whether you're an adult versus an immature, a subordinate versus a dominant, a stranger versus someone who's familiar, the son of the beta versus the daughter of the alpha, or whether you're actually, Sally. I put Sally in scare quotes because to this point we don't know that they name one another, but you're the individual that we as researchers recognize as Sally, and you're the individual that they recognize as some particular individual. Okay? So the upshot of this is that I think relatively simple vocal announcements of who you are, and therefore what age class you're in, whether you're male or a female, whether you're large or small, or whether you're the alpha versus the beta, those can be extremely functional in getting work done within a primate social group. Okay? And what's interesting about that is that that's based on these very simple and ubiquitous cues to just critical social distinctions related to age, sex, size, and identity, which may be largely unselected and epiphenomenal. Okay? So a lot of functional social complexity can arise from relatively straightforward differences in vocal anatomy and the sounds that result for reasons that aren't selected for that communicative function per se. Okay, this is relevant obviously because in the human dynamic, of course, who's who is everything as well. Okay, social identity is central to human sociality, so exactly the same distinctions can underscore a lot of human social engagement. I'm trying to capture that very briefly and simply with this picture. Does anyone know who the guy on the right is here? I figured I'm in California. If anyone knows, you might. I use this photo frequently to assuming, of course, that no one knows the guy on the right, but everyone knows the guy on the left. Okay, so I can tell you that even in Canada and relatively remote parts of Canada, we know who this guy is. We have no idea who this guy is. And so I think this photo nicely captures the importance of all of these different distinctions. First, there are a couple of elderly guys, and there's a reason why a couple of elderly guys are more likely to be captured in a political campaign photo like this. Okay, they're both guys. There's a reason why guys are more likely to be, sadly, still to this day, to be captured in a photo like this. This is a big fella and a particular individual. And so there's a good reason why you know him and not him, and why he's probably looking somewhat subservient. Okay? Okay, so exactly the same kinds of social dimensions underscore lots of human social engagement, and these social dimensions are cued by exactly the same features of the voice in human as in non-human primates. Okay? So some of the noted effects been established with respect to voice pitch and resonance patterns in human social affairs. We know that people are sensitive to low pitch or formant patterns in conveying things about differences in size and social potency, dominance and authority. That's captured by that little photographic distinction over there between two characters that some of you will know. Not all of you will know all of them, but some of you will. This might help.
It is pointless to resist, my son.
Pee-wee's playhouse, Pee-wee's picnic.
Okay, I guess all of you know the first one. Some of you might not have the misfortune of knowing the second one, but their voices, say it all. Okay, it's a reason why Pee Wee Herman was not cast in the role of Darth Vader. Okay, we also know that these pitch and formant patterns of the voice also play a role in people's perceptions of attractiveness, where once again, low pitch and low timbral quality voices are associated with female assessments of men as being more masculine and attractive, and the reverse pattern in men assessing females' voices, where high pitch and formant patterns in general are regarded as being more feminine and attractive. And these exactly the same voice qualities actually undergird a variety of additional attributions that people are seemingly quite willing to make, having to do with intelligence, credibility, and trustworthiness, captured in the photos here of these broadcasters. James Earl Jones is not a broadcaster, but he might well be. His voice has been used to good effect.
This is CNN.
You all must know this. I don't know if they still use this. I don't pay attention to CNN. Do you still use that little clip from CNN? Do you still hear that sometimes? Yeah, okay. And why do we do that? It's because you can trust everything that comes after that, right? Imagine if Pee Wee Herman were doing it. This is CNN, right? You'd be like, oh, I'm not listening anymore, you know? Whatever follows this just can't be true, right? But somehow, when James Earl Jones says it, this is CNN, you're like, oh my God, I'm riveted, you know? It's whatever he says is whoever comes on next, you know, Peter Jennings or Walter Cronkite, all of whom are selected for exactly these same voice quality characteristics, you can trust them. Okay, trust this news. Now, I've referred to this as the halo effect. Many of you in psychology will know this is an effect where, based on one kind of set of characteristics, you're willing to attribute a whole bunch others. So if you're pretty, you're also likely to be intelligent. You're likely to be ethically more upstanding, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, if you have a low-pitched voice, which is associated with size, dominance, authority, and maybe attractiveness, people are willing to make a bunch of additional attributions, positive attributions to you, in this case with respect to your overall level of intelligence and credibility, even though we have absolutely no reason to think there's any connection between the pitch of the voice and intelligence or credibility. Not that I'm slandering James Earl Jones at all. I'm sure he's a very good guy, and I'm sure he is credible and trustworthy, but I have no reason to assume that based on the pitch of his voice, whereas I can say that he is a fairly sizable character. Okay, upshot of this is that these basic social and lexical functions of communication are similar in human and non-human primates, okay? That's where I think there's some really core continuity in communication systems between the two groups. What I think is, you know, arguably more possibly interesting and exciting vis-a-vis the issue of origins of certain aspects of language are that some of these primitive social and lexical features, I think, may help to bootstrap some of the more derived informational properties of language. And so I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about that. Here's an example that we can refer to formally as semantic entrenchment of size-based voice, pitch, and formant effects, or what I prefer to call the itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny yellow polka dot bikini effect. Okay? Those words themselves, does anyone have an itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny yellow polka dot bikini? Maybe not. You do, yes. Okay, right. So, it's good. Feisty, good. Is this a large garment? Very small. It is, isn't it? Okay, and there's a reason. Okay, imagine trying to market the opsy flopsy blopsy phallopsy bikini or whatever. It wouldn't work, right? The words themselves tell you that this is a small garment. It's probably no surprise why it's a bikini and not a babwali or wow or something. I can't even do it because I so want to say eeny at the end. Okay. So we call this vowel-specific formant marking of size diminution augmentation, basically that the sound of the word itself helps to convey the distinction itself, okay? And that's done in the following ways. Here are a cartoon version of the formant profiles of 4 different words, the same except for the vowel content in the middle, beat, bit, but, and bot. Pay attention to the F2 here, the second formant frequency, which is critical in the distinguishing between those different vowel sounds. You see it's high in this case and low in this case. These are referred to as what are called high front vowels. Those are low back vowels. These are high front vowels because in producing them, you bunch the tongue at the front of your mouth, creating a relatively small front cavity, which has a high frequency second formant here, okay? Whereas the low back vowels are so called because you bunch your tongue low and at the back of your mouth, creating a relatively large resonating chamber here, which then, as a large thing, has a lower frequency resonance, okay? So this literally beat and bit sound to you perceptually small by comparison to but and bought, because your perceptual system is paying attention to that second formant frequency, and it's high here. High things are associated with small things. Low here, low frequency things are associated with big things, okay? And so that's used to good effect in English and in some other languages in denoting particular semantic contrasts between small and large things, okay? So words for small things like bit, tip, and chip versus large versions of the same thing, hunk, lump, and chunk. Okay, so when you're hungry after Halloween and you want some pumpkin pie, you'd probably be pretty happy to have a hunk, lump, or a chunk of it. You might be a bit disappointed if you got a bit, tip, or a chip. Okay, small versus large. With respect to force and authority, you see exactly the same kinds of distinction. Hit, club, slap, slug. I would argue that this has more serious consequences than this, okay? And it's captured right in the sounds of the words themselves. In distinctions of age and authority, names. A standard way to change a man's name into a boy's name is to add a high front vowel at the end. So William becomes Willie or Billy, James becomes Jimmy, Michael becomes Mikey, okay? And naturally enough, oftentimes when those boys grow up and become men, they like to revert to the more formal name because it doesn't come with that diminution kind of effect, okay? Same thing in women's voices. If you want to change a woman's name into a girl's name, Sarah becomes Sally, Anne, Annie, Catherine, Katie, Elizabeth, Lizzie, and the same thing in feminizing masculine names. So Jack becomes Jackie, William, Wilhelmina, George, Georgina, Paul, Paulina, Max, Maxine, etc. Okay? A way of using the sound semantic effects of the vowels themselves to convey the semantics, the semantic distinctions you want to make. Okay, that's a fairly common one, well recognized, and there's some cross-cultural work that supports these patterns in different languages. Here's another proposed kind of biosemantic relationship in language that I would argue is traceable to some conserved elements of signal structure and our neuroaffective sensitivity to variation in signal structure that comes from non-human primates. So here's a classic example of alarm calls produced by vervet monkeys. Vervet monkeys studied by Peter Marler, Robert Seyfried, Dorothy Cheney in response to a variety of different predators that are preyed on them. You're familiar with this story. Each kind of class of predator elicits a slightly different kind of alarm call from the monkeys. And this is just a spectrogram of the different alarm calls they give, one to a snake, to leopard-type things, eagle-type things. You can see the differences between them. But in fact, if you plot these out next to the alarm calls of some other closely related non-human primates, you see that the structure of all those vervet alarm calls is quite similar to the general structure of alarm calls in baboons and rhesus monkeys, even if baboons and rhesus don't have a set of different alarm calls. Globally, they occupy the same kind of space, spectral space, and I just emphasize that by showing you a repertoire of about half the vocalizations produced by rhesus monkeys. They're capable of producing a range of different sorts of sounds. They're not limited to just these harsh, noisy sounds. They can produce tonal, harmonic types of sounds, very tonal, rapidly, frequently modulated ones, combinations of that. So these all occupy a relatively small, sort of area in the multidimensional acoustic space the animals are capable of, and there's no coincidence. I think that kind of acoustic structure is highly functional in the alarm situation. I'll just play a baboon alarm call for you to try and illustrate this. And if you're standing right next to them, it elicits this kind of a response from a naive infant who doesn't yet know much about the predators that are likely to prey on it. It can be going about its business. Immediately, this kind of alerting, orienting sort of response. We actually know from comparative psychoacoustics that the characteristics of these alarm calls, namely being high amplitude, abrupt onset, plosive types of things with a broadband, noisy spectral structure, are actually best designed to elicit a reflex that is common in all hearing vertebrates that have been tested, acoustic startle reflex, that is associated with a set of reflexive response involving immediate attention to the source, cessation of ongoing activity, stimulation of limbic and brainstem areas, regulating overall brain activation, arousal, basically preparing the animal for a kind of a fight or flight response, which is obviously highly compatible with predator avoidance, and specifically in the context of young and naive infants who don't yet know the kinds of things to pay attention to in the world. When they hear a sound like this, it establishes the ecological relevance, the event salience for the animals, and then rapidly facilitates social learning about predators that they can't come into the world knowing about. They pay attention to what mother is doing, what other group members are doing, and then subsequently engage in, over a period of time, adaptive responding, even though they don't come into the world with that knowledge to begin with. So these kinds of sounds are well designed to facilitate that kind of response. Totally different class of sounds we've already talked about, these kind of contact calls, which are relatively harmonic, smooth sorts of sounds. They have a different kind of hedonic value. They have a more kind of neutral or positive hedonic value associated with relaxed socializing in general. This is relevant to a particular phenomenon that was first described, I think, by Wolfgang Kohler in the middle of the last century, referred to as the Buba-Kiki effect, where Kohler observed that if you provided these unfamiliar kinds of nonsense images to people and then offered them an option of labeling them with two otherwise unfamiliar and nonsense kinds of words, contrary to the sort of the Saussurean dictum that language is completely arbitrary and there should be no reason to match one word with one object versus another word with another object. People consistently match the word booba with the rounded object here and the word kiki with the jagged object, okay? And so this is interesting because we assumed for a very long time that there was absolutely no reason that a word would be structured to go with a particular sort of a reference. Now, these are nonsense objects, of course, but nevertheless, people seem to have a strong disposition to match particular sorts of words to particular sorts of objects, and it went on to be studied by a variety of other folks using some additional kinds of shapes that preserve the overall sort of roundness but in different ways, or the overall kind of jaggedness or fractured nature of the images in different ways, and using different words than booba and kiki, also naluma and taketa, buma and bamu and goga. Kohler, when he first discovered this, he didn't provide, as I recall, any kind of mechanistic or functional explanation for why the matching relationship might exist, but a guy named neuroscientist named Ramachandran subsequently did provide a functional explanation that he ultimately tried to link to the origins of consciousness, but the upshot of his argument was that it involved a kind of a synesthetic sort of a relationship where these words here all have rounded vowels in them, meaning they're vowels that you produce with a round mouth articulation, okay, oo and ah, and therefore one in either seeing or hearing, silently producing maybe these words, the somatosensory feedback that you would get from your motor system, either explicitly or implicitly producing that rounded vowel, puts you in mind of the visual representation of something that is rounded. Ramachandran, as I recall, didn't provide any explanation for why you would match these objects with, or these words with these objects, other than simply by default when they're offered in a two alternative sort of force or whatever. You know, this goes, or actually in a matched context, you have to match one with the other. This goes here, then by default, kiki must go there. So what I just said about those different kinds of signal structures in primates in very different kinds of contexts, I think offers us an alternative explanation for what might be going on, is that calls that are given in the context of relaxed social affiliation have a particular sort of harmonic vowel-like kind of a structure. Calls that are given in the context of very dire situations involving predators or social agonism, like fights like this, tend to be much different, high amplitude, broadband, very noisy in structure, and that those signals induce in listeners very different kinds of affective states, as I've already sort of said. And that then gives you a natural alternative for explaining this matching pattern, that in fact, it may not be the vowels, but actually the consonant content that's driving things here, where in each of these words on the rounded side, the vowel sounds are relatively voiced, okay? So they involve pre or rapid post-articulation voicing of the vocal folds, creating a more harmonic or vowel-like kind of a sound. Here's the waveform of an L and an N and the spectrum that is nicely conditioned as a sort of a harmonic kind of a sound, compared to the consonants here, which are unvoiced and therefore have a more noisy and strident structure to them. Here's the spectrum of one of them, a T or a K here, okay, waveform of them. Chaotic versus patterned, structure is noisy versus harmonic. Okay, simple little distinction. You're all familiar with that. The T's and the K's at the end, the L and the N type vowel type consonants at the beginning. And so the matching may be done based on differences in the consonant structure of the sounds themselves, not the vowels. Noisy, strident things, putting you in mind of harsh and fractured types of images. Relatively harmonic or sonorant type consonants, putting you in mind of smooth, connected types of objects. There's a very simple way to test this using the original paradigm. Just swap the consonant content and see where people go. If they're paying attention to the vowel sounds, as Ramachandran hypothesized, they shouldn't change their choice here. Kuka should still go here, Bibi should go here, but I would guess that you would already have a sense, if you're still with me, you'd put Kuka here and Bibi here, and that's in fact what people do if we change the consonant content. Here are some specific findings that I said I wouldn't show you, but I will just to make this point, from a graduate student named Alan Nielsen, where subject's choice, when you give them the original words and stimuli, they match Buba to Kiki very reliably, as all subjects in all cultures have. If you then swap the consonant content, they don't maintain. They're matching Kuka here and Bibi here, just as we suspected. Kuka goes here and Bibi goes here. So their performance, if you continue to score it based on the vowel content, drops very low. They're very bad at it, and that's because they're not following the vowel consonant content. They're following the consonant content. Okay. Okay, and then he, for his master's thesis, did a variety of other studies, carefully controlling the construction of figures, which had been a problem in this literature for a long time, that they used very stylized images that were, the distinctions between round and jagged were very obvious. Subjects' very high performance on these experiments was argued to be a function of the fact that the task was completely transparent to them, was obvious what you were trying to test. So what Alan painstakingly did was generate randomized curved and jagged objects in this way, so that he could create objects that were exactly matched for the number of inflection points that they had, but those inflections involved either rounded or jagged contours to them. And you can see that if you were to look at these things even side by side, they look pretty similar. If you show them to people serially, so they can't actually look at them side by side, the task becomes even harder. Nevertheless, found exactly the same patterns, though with lower accuracy, certainly, given that the task became much harder. Anyway, gone on, did lots of other experiments on this, looking for general kinds of biases or preferences in how people construct these nonsense words. I won't go through the details of this for you, but suffice to say that people do show some fairly regular patterns in their construction, even of nonsense words. Question, of course, is whether or not any of these biases are reflected in real words in contemporary languages, and we don't have the answer to that. But this seems to be part of a kind of a growing effort to look for systematicity in language and in other aspects of human endeavor, like music, as Greg here in your group is doing recently. Looking for systematicity in these aspects of human enterprise in ways that you can actually trace back to these conserved features of signal structure in non-human primates, and potentially even further in lots of other animal species besides. Okay. So quite speculatively, I wonder about the value of kind of thinking about the evolution or natural selection of linguistic form, completely sort of contrary to the Saussurean dictum that the form of words is completely arbitrary with respect to their reference, that in a sense that doesn't make any sense, certainly not from a biologist with a biologist background, thinking about the connection between form and function. Function follows form. You might expect there actually to be some pre-prepared kind of biases that people bring into the world that make certain kinds of words as children more learnable more memorable and therefore more deployable, both because you can conjure them better because of their natural connections to their semantic references, more deployable because they will have more efficient effects on listeners, again because of the same natural semantic connections they have through the sounds of them themselves. So we can call that a kind of a prepared biophonetics, biosemantics or something like that, and that those effects then are filtered through a variety of other social cultural effects related to social modeling, cultural identity, etc. Over historical time. That will mean that some of those effects will probably dissipate and they'll be lost, so you'll end up in the lexicon with a variety of words that don't make any sense with respect to these kinds of effects. Okay, so they are, well, we'll call them arbitrary, but they've come about through a non-arbitrary process. But whale is a very small word for a very big thing. Streptococcus is a very big word for a very small thing. But some of them will preserve some of this, kind of connection potentially. Okay, so I think it gives us, a kind of an exciting way to think about language structure and how it might be traced to some of the biological underpinnings that we see in non-human animals and the psychoacoustic kinds of sensitivities we have to those sounds. Okay, so then returning then to the relevance or irrelevance of primate communication, I guess the upshot for me is that these are the things that are kind of irrelevant. Non-human primate communication is not going to tell us very much about those things, the big three of language, but it is relevant in a variety of other respects, okay, where the continuity is likely to be in these broader relationships we've been talking about with respect to vocal anatomy, mechanics, similar kinds of sounds that human and non-human primates produce, common, very basic perceptual neuroaffective sensitivities to sound, how those structure a lot of basic social and industrial functions of communication in both kinds of groups, and then finally this possibility that some, at least very rudimentary aspects of linguistic structure might be bootstrapped from some of those common effects. So for me, that's kind of where some of the exciting action might be in thinking about language origins and the relevance of primate communication systems in particular. If you're willing to indulge me, I told you, sorry, this is a fixed action pattern. This is a point where the fixed action pattern can be terminated. It won't be restarted, I promise you that. But I would, if you'll indulge me, I'd carry on for a few minutes more and just talk about some of the things related to how our metaphor-driven theory can influence our findings in the way, yes, thank you, Dan, that's exactly the cue I needed. Okay, how did we go so far wrong is basically the question. How did we get led astray? Well, you all had Lara Boer-Dixie here, I think, last year or the year before. Okay, she and lots of others prior to that have told us about the dangers of metaphor. They've told you how metaphor shapes, how the language you use shapes how you think about the world. Okay? Yes, absolutely, it does, I think, and this applies per force to us as scientists. So the constructs that we adopt, metaphors we use, shape in important ways and color how we see the phenomenon that we are literally trying to describe and interpret, okay? And that means that you have to be, I think, constantly vigilant to your theoretical constructs. Here's the standard model of animal communication captured in this, kind of cartoon form down here at the bottom. Signaler and a receiver, information being transmitted between them. The standard model of animal communication for primates and all other animals basically involves asking the question, what do animal signals mean? What information do they encode and transmit? And that kind of model comes from, as I started this talk, from partly from the Don Griffin, Peter Marler sort of tradition, but also from the broader revolution in the 1950s of Chomsky and linguistics and the origins of modern computers. Okay, so how those two things went together. The computer became, and its information processing capacity became a critical metaphor for understanding language and also understanding mind, okay? Eponymously then reified in terms of new disciplines like computational linguistics, computational theories of mind, okay? So minds are literally computers, symbol manipulators. Language is a system of symbol transmission. Animal signaling is a simpler sort of form of language, okay? So this linguistic and computational sort of framework was then ported to studies of animal communication, such that the standard model model of animal communication then involves a signaler who has thoughts and feelings that get translated into a message that is then encoded and transmitted, flows as a packet of information to a receiver who receives that signal, decodes it to recover the original message and retrieve whatever the ideational or representational content was to begin with. And so the purpose of communication is to transmit information between signaler and receiver. Okay? What's wrong with this model? A whole pile of things, I think. In principle, it is entirely teleological, anthropocentric, and anthropomorphic. It involves starting with a single and possibly very derived system of communication in humans, namely language, and then backwards modeling the communication systems of a variety of increasingly distantly related species, making a bit of a hash of, the insight, the Darwinian insight that the product of evolution is a bush, not a ladder, okay? Effectively modeling other communication systems as simply waypoints on the way to language, and effectively then obliterating, all of the complexity and frankly interesting stuff that's going on here that can create entirely different systems of communication where there's no reason to think that they're all ultimately leading to language. In practice, even in the best cases of language-like communication, the constructs don't really apply, okay? And so here's the paradigm example of language-like communication in a non-human primate. Again, the work of Seyfarth, Cheney, and Marler together working on vervet monkeys documented a small repertoire of different alarm calls for different predator species that preyed upon them, and a lot of the excitement about that was the extent to which this did look very much like some rudimentary properties of language in an animal. So they were argued to be intentional signals, that the calls themselves were arbitrarily structured because a leopard alarm call didn't sound like a leopard, neither did an eagle alarm call sound like an eagle, therefore they were like words and being arbitrarily structured, and further they had representational value or semantic meaning. We now know that none of those things is really true, leading Cheney and Seyfarth themselves almost 20 years ago now to conclude that the mental mechanisms underlying the vocalizations of non-human primates fundamentally different from those that underlie human speech. Other folks interested in the evolution of cognition and language enterprise, Mike Tomasello, concluding in his book on Origins of Language, can't remember the title exactly, 2008, primate vocal displays basically no different from those of other mammals. Displays are unlearned, genetically fixed, emotionally urgent, involuntary, and flexible responses. How can such mechanical reflexes be a direct precursor to the complexities of human communication and language? That's a statement that's even balder than anything offensive I've said. Mark Hauser even, 40 years of research have been invested in the capacity of animals to produce or comprehend externalized symbols. Relevant evidence that they do so is at best weak, and nevertheless we continue to look for the rudiments of some of those high-level properties of languages in primate communication systems. Okay? So even in the best cases, the language-like constructs don't apply. In a more fundamental sense, the concepts of meaning and information, they're very intuitive to us, they're familiar to us, but in the context of animal behavior and animal communication, they're relatively loose and undefined, and they don't map very readily onto normal evolutionary and ethological kinds of constructs. Okay? So if you were to ask, where are the functions of signaling in this cartoon, or where are the mechanisms, it gets a bit blurry, but some proponents would tell you, well, these are obviously the mechanisms. These are, kind of the mental processes that are underlying this informational network. Quite possible, those we've just said, they don't seem to apply even in the most language-like cases, much less all of the others that no one has said bear any relationship to language. And the function, if you press them, what's the function of communication here? They'd say, as we said before, it's to transmit information from a signaler to a receiver, except that, as we all know, transmitting information isn't a standard biological or ethological function, except for DNA, which is about the transmission of discrete packages of information from one generation to the next. Transmitting information is not an ethological function in and of itself. Okay? And the way of thinking about that might be to turn sort of the issue on its head. When we ask about what are the meaning of vocal signals, you say that's a kind of a strange question to ask even. We don't ask as ethologists what the meaning of grooming behavior is, or the meaning of foraging behavior is, or the meaning of parenting behavior. We ask what's the function of those things, right? So you wouldn't even ask the question of the meaning of a behavior except for communication, and in particular vocal communication. It also involves some very unnecessary appeal to additional informational constructs. In particular, this one is frequently appealed to in the literature, that animals are encoding information that is transmitted to others, and receivers have to decode that information that's in the signal. So the idea of encoding and decoding is fundamental to all conceptions of animal communication, not just primates. Encoding, in a formal sense, involves translation of something from one domain into another, okay? And what I would argue is that, encoding, it's certainly a possibility, and I think there's reason to refer to language processes is involving encoding and decoding of information. In the case of animal communication, completely unnecessary, because most of the kinds of dimensions, at least the ones that I've been focusing on here today, common social distinctions that undergird the social behavior of these animals, like distinctions between adults and immatures, between males and females, between large individuals and small individuals, and between individual A, B, and C, those things are actually communicated directly. There's no encoding process involved. So, the bigger guy goes book, and the littler guy goes bick. Okay, and as you've just learned, the big versus small is in the sound itself, and it's in the sound itself because the big guy has a bigger larynx, which produces a lower frequency sound. It's not encoding that frequency. That is just what a big larynx sounds like. Okay, and likewise, this is just what a small larynx sounds like. So you don't have to appeal to any process of encoding. Likewise, you don't necessarily have to appeal to any process of decoding. The dimensions of big and small in this case are perceptually direct ones. A little bit more disconcertingly, it leads to additional mischaracterizations of phenomena. The worst is probably, I think, that because of this informational model, the assumption is that signalers are working together with receivers. They're cooperating to provide information to receivers, okay? And that information is honest. It's veridical information, something about themselves or some state of the world, and that's because receivers are in the privileged position of being able to ignore anything other than honest or reliable signals. And this is a fundamental tenet of communication theory that you will see in all of the major textbooks, where the problem of communication now is defined as how do you guarantee honesty in a signaling system? How do you guarantee that signals are honest? And the idea is you guarantee honesty because receivers just discount anything else. Evolutionarily speaking, if the information were unreliable, you just wouldn't pay attention to it, okay? And that's a fair enough assumption, except that I think it is completely naive, okay? There's a whole classes of signals in the world that are fundamentally, you are unable to simply ignore them, okay? We have a new mother in the audience, relatively new mother in the audience. Here's a nice example of a signal that is very difficult to ignore and to habituate to, much as you might like. Now, you shouldn't be habituating to it now, of course, probably, but a little later on, when it's time for your son or daughter to be getting more independent, you'll be trying a little harder, possibly, to ignore some of these things. Those of us who aren't even a caregiver, I can tell you, will have even less patience for this, not unlike maybe a sibling who is trying to block this out. Lots of other classes of animal signals exactly the same way. Okay, harmless little caterpillar here that looks like a snake head. This is not honest and veridical information. Okay, so I think that the informational systems approach to things encourages a view of communication that's fundamentally out of step with the mismatch between signaler and receiver interests that we know characterizes a lot of communication systems. And it also gives us the illusory feeling that we have actually explained a phenomena when we haven't. Okay? I've got an example here that I can show you, but it'll take a couple of minutes to go through, so I won't do it now, but if people are interested, I can talk about it later. But I think one good example of this is the vervet monkey alarm call story, which 40 years later we still have no better understanding of. Okay, we now have some good reason to think that the calls are not semantic in the respect that they were originally proposed to be, but we actually have no full understanding of what the function of their calls are and what the mechanisms are that are driving them. Why do they produce those alarm calls, and how does it actually function in an adaptive sense for the animals themselves? And those are straightforward questions that you would ask about any form of behavior, but that we haven't actually asked about this classic example in animal communication, because we thought we had the problem solved when we parsed it into snake alarm, eagle alarm, leopard alarm, and we left it at that. Okay? And so the lesson for me in that is partly that your theoretical constructs become reified themselves as real entities. And so in this informational systems model, these things are really black boxes. They're placeholders for a concrete explanation of the function and the mechanisms involved, but we accept them as the explanations themselves when we can provide an interpretation of, vervet alarm calls communicate information about predators, and there is some kind of representational encoding and decoding model. Well, we have reason to think that that's not actually true, and we've been satisfied with leaving it in terms of those black boxes. Okay? So you have to be a little careful, I think, about your theoretical constructs, because they represent kind of top-down influences on your research. Okay? You start with a set of constructs, and then they'll color how you interpret the phenomena that you see in the world. Okay? And so this, to me, is a nice illustration of that. My God, some of you will see something here that is not really here. Okay? So, as I like to say, a goat's crotch is sometimes just a goat's crotch, okay? There's no need to look any further than this, okay? And if you've been put in mind, either because of your background or because of me saying, oh my God, if you're put in mind of, this, you're more likely to see something kind of saintly in this than you might otherwise. So don't be fooled. Okay. So a bunch of this stuff has been summarized kind of recently by Michael Ovren and I in a book chapter. I'm just going to give a fast plug for. I realize after a long talk like this, the last thing you want to do is go and kind of look at something more that I have to say. Okay, but if you do, if you can stomach that, it's a chapter where we try and flesh out a bunch of the arguments that I've just tried to give you in cursory form here today, and point us in alternative directions. Look for non-informational alternative frameworks for understanding animal communication, and there are lots of good models out there historically from others. And I think they've had a time when they've had some attention, but then kind of been neglected. And so I think they need to be resurrected and considered again seriously. Okay, I'm gonna stop and thank you very much for your patience indulging me. Clark.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I think we part ways rather significantly in our interpretation of informational theory and communication. So I think there would be a lot of points of disagreement, and we can talk about that later. One thing that you said that points to where I think maybe the disagreement might be, as an example, is you said something like an animal needs to, or an organism needs to understand the effects of its signal on the receiver in order to signal. Is that?
No, I just think that that's one of the interesting paradoxes, is that vervet monkeys produce alarm calls that are perfectly functional in warning kin. We assume that they're probably kin selected. At least that's the function of it, even though that's never been tested. Never been tested, 45 years on. So somehow that part of the problem, even though it's the core ethological biological question, has taken a back seat to the linguistic parsing of them, which we now know is quite erroneous. But I think what's really fascinating about it, and this is, I think, some of the elegance in natural selection that Darwin would be referring to, there is grandeur in this view of life, where animals who have no idea of the informational value of their signals, nevertheless, it has in a lay parsing of it in informational terms, it has informational value in a sense, right? That is, it does prompt a functional escape response, even though the animals themselves have no idea that it has that effect, which is fascinating. And it means you don't have to spirit into the organism their understanding of it. They don't need to understand any of that, exactly.
Does any signaler need to understand the effect of their signal?
Absolutely, but the difference is in language you do.
No.
Yeah, yes, you do. Yes, you do.
That's where we would disagree. So we can talk about
Okay,
that later.
okay, yeah.
So you're claiming that animals don't ever communicate intentionally?
Well,
Intentional.
but my grade school teachers told me never ever circle the answer that says never or ever. So I'm not going to say never.
Intentionality, red X,
Yes.
we know for sure that there's no intentionality.
Yeah, I was being deliberately argumentative or combative. Yeah. So I would say that there is no good evidence for any non-human primate, except possibly some of the great apes, chimpanzees, that there is even a modicum of intentionality. And in them, there may be a modicum of intentionality, which is interesting. That might be the toehold on what you need, to get going for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's more to discuss later.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciate your candor too. It's very entertaining. I wonder if you could comment on, so this isn't my area at all, but in the last couple of years there's been in the pop science media a lot of talk about bonobos, which are claimed to be going through more stringent experiments and testing. So there's talk of the language capabilities, both with the lexicograms and also vocalizations, and then possibly being context dependent meaning for a given call and precursors to language. Have you comment on
Well, I'm not sure the specifics of what we're referring to, what findings in particular we're talking about, but yeah, I can comment a little bit. In fact, I was just talking with Joe Manson earlier about some recent findings for vervet monkeys, which now tell a slightly different story about the alarm call system, where in fact the calls are not nearly as discrete and not nearly as categorically associated with different predators, but in fact there's quite a lot more noise in the system than was originally appreciated, and that in fact, to the extent that you want to parse them as having any kind of meaning anymore, that it is kind of contextually driven. And that is argued then to make them even more language-like than they were before, in a kind of an interesting sort of argumentative sleight of hand, where what made them language-like before was the fact that they were quite discrete and categorically associated with things. The original argument was then you don't need to know anything about the context in order to respond appropriately to a leopard alarm call, because you hear "oh" and immediately leopard in your head, you take off for the trees. You don't need to pay attention to anything else. That's what made them word-like, because words are discrete and have that kind of representational value on their own, independently of context. Now the argument is, well, it wasn't like that, but it's actually that you need to understand something about the context to sort out what the message is. And that makes them more like language, because, of course, that parsing of language was also a bit simplistic too, right? That context, pragmatics, etc., is very important for linguistic meaning. So I think in both cases, the pitfall is we're constantly looking to try and parse these things in terms of language. Let's just parse them in terms of what makes sense for the organism. What's the function of it? What are the underlying mechanisms? And then if you want to go from that to language, think about how you get from whatever it's doing for them to what you've got in language, rather than constantly having your language blinkers on to interpret everything they're doing in terms of language to begin with. If that's your lens to begin with, then you can't help but see what they're doing in some kind of language-like way. So it'll be it'll go some distance to being language-like, because that's the lens you've put on it to begin with. If you get rid of that lens, interpret it in the context that they give you, have it sort of phenomena-driven rather than theory-driven, then I think you can begin to look at what they're doing and compare it to what humans are doing and say, okay, now, where are the similarities? Andrew.
So, thank you. Appreciate this. I guess my question is, it seems like you're giving stance to vocal communication as being language, whereas I think there are good arguments to be made for the, like, communicative value of gesture and that sort of being
Yep.
a domain from which language could be bootstrapped. So,
Yep.
I mean, do you not think that that element is important, or was that just?
I do, and possibly I wasn't careful enough at the outset to say that my focus on this today and throughout whatever it is I've done in this area has been looking at vocal communication. And what I'm saying is that I think if you're looking for the primate rudiments of language, there are some in those more basic structural features we talked about and how they undergird social relationships. They're not in the high-level informational properties on the vocal communication side. Yeah. With respect to gestural or visual kinds of signals, I'm going to remain agnostic on that, but I actually think that your instinct on this is probably spot on, at least insofar as with respect to many forms of gesture, and certainly manual gesture, this is something we know that primates have volitional control over. Okay? We know they don't have volitional control over their vocal apparatus. And so that may be what's keeping them from demonstrating, whatever level of intentionality they might actually have, okay? Because they can't link that to their vocal communication system. Why that's the case is a good question, but we know they don't have volitional control of that. They do have volitional control of this and potentially some aspects of facial gesture and other kinds of, bodily gesture. So if you were looking for, some additional evidence of connection there, I think that's a real good place to look, absolutely.
Some of the work coming out of Thomas lab lately, there's definitely, I think evidence at least for intentionality in those modalities.
Right. Right. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's where there could well be some productive action yet to be had. Yeah. Go.
Thank you. I realize this critique is sort of, and this is an overview of it, but sort of, inside it is a critique of the interpretation of a pretty large body of experimental evidence. And so I'd just like to ask you to focus on one body of evidence, and that is the experiments by Klaus Zuberbuehler that purport to show syntactic qualities. So you take two calls, and depending on the order in which you have a playback, you generate a playback, and depending on the order of the two calls, it will elicit quite different behavior patterns in the listeners. And so, in response to the argument that is demonstrating kind of rudimentary syntax, what would you say?
Methinks the lady doth protest too much. I think if you're arguing that hard and stretching that far, it actually makes the opposite point much more profoundly. I'm just continuing in this bald line of attack that I started the talk with, so I feel compelled to continue it. Again, that's a simple call combination difference. Okay, if that's what you call syntax. We lost our linguist. He was sitting next to Ed. Do we have any other linguists in the audience? No? How comfortable are you with that as syntax? I don't know. I think we end up doing ourselves a disservice. In fact, and this is partly the broader point is, I think as primatologists, I think we do ourselves a bit of a disservice, constantly tilting at these what are frankly quite high-level properties of language, and trying to convince the rest of the world that we're partway there. These animals have it. And for most of the folks, say in linguistics, philosophers of language, they look at it and they say, come on. They've stopped paying attention because we've bombarded them with evidence that they frankly don't find very compelling. And I think maybe we can do better than that. I think maybe looking at the gestural side, might be a more credible way to go for sure, and for good reason. They've got volitional control. I think that's a very good suggestion. Yeah. If we want to get the attention and respect of our other scholarly colleagues back, I think that's what we should do. That sounds harsh, I'm sorry.